Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how to create interesting backgrounds for your drawings using ink and coffee. So far in our drawings we've been using only white plain paper and we've been concentrating on accuracy in the drawings. And now we're moving into trying to present more energy in our artworks. And using paper that have texture or color can help in that endeavor. So here you can see some of the example of a pre-created paper. Sometimes you can use the old artwork or paper that you've used to cover your table when you've been working, or using some inks. You can just straight away use a different colored paper. If you are in the painting class and you've got a leftover paint, you can use that to paint some papers for a future. So those are just a few examples of the papers that might be useful for you. Some of them are going to be easier to work with. For example, something very toned down or light will be much easier to work with than something that's got a lot of texture. The two things that we're going to do, we are going to use some coffee to create backgrounds and ink. But those are not the only two ways to create interesting backgrounds. You could use some leftover acrylic and the palette night for some texture. You can add some masking tape or stick other things. Use some droplets, create collages. Use some ink and bleach, or just a simple watercolor or watered down acrylic. What you can see in those pieces of papers, the colors are kind of muted and toned down here because we still want to create a background that will show our drawing quite nicely. Hence, very muted, earthy colors. Okay, let's start. So, first of all, protect whatever surface you're working on. I'm using some plastic bag here, and I advise you to use the same as we are going to work with pretty messy and wet technique. Pick up an A3 paper or cut your A2 paper in half and have whatever you're going to use on hand. So I'm going to start actually with the ink first. I've got my brush here, the same as you've got in your pack, but I'm going to use a bigger brush because the area here is bigger. So if I was going to use my ink as it is, that would be very dark and it would create a very dark area. So first thing I will need to do is I will need to water down my ink. So I'm going to pick up some water, use either a palette or an old plate and water down my ink. That's a bit probably too much, to have a lightish version of that color. And when I'm going to create my background, I'm going to work pretty quickly and smoothly with it. If I've got a wet area, I could come back to it while it's still wet with my ink if I want some darker surface. But generally speaking, I want to work pretty quickly with it. If I've got an area that I think it's a bit too dark for my needs, I can use the tissue to take away that shade. That will create kind of a nice texture. The other thing I could do is I could pre-wet my paper with some spray bottle. Okay, which will allow the ink to move around and create some very interesting areas here. Okay, I could also dribble some paint. I'm going to repeat that with a bit of a stronger ink. Okay. The key thing is you should be working pretty quickly to create your background. When you've done, lift your paper very carefully because it's very, very wet. I feel like I'm ready for some work with coffee. But first I'm going to tidy up the surface. Awesome. So the coffee that I've got in here, it's just a normal coffee, a cheap instant coffee. No sugar or milk, please, because those might actually cause your work to go off. And I'm going to change my water. So I've got a new water here to work with. Here we go. Okay, so when you work with a coffee, straight away, you will notice two things. The color that you're going to achieve, it's going to be very warm, very brownish. Okay, so depending how strong you've made your coffee, you might or might not need to water it down. Now, the cool things that you can do with the coffee, you can actually do some really funky imprints. Okay. And of course, the same like with the ink, you could add some splashes, and the splashes will behave differently on the wet surface than on the surface that is dry. You could use some spray to move your paint around, and also you can use either a tissue or a piece of cloth if you want to adjust your backgrounds. There's nothing there to stop you from mixing both coffee and tea. So I am going to grab a bit of ink, put it on the edge of my glass, and create some imprints. I like that actually. I think it's a bit too dark, so I can work and water it down maybe and take some of the areas away. I think I will also add a few darken points of ink. But if something is too strong, go and calm it down. You're going to have a drawing on top of it, so you don't want it to be too strong. You want it to be interesting enough that when you add drawing on top of it, it's going to be nice. So leave those to dry, and in a few hours, you're going to have interesting backgrounds to draw on. Thank you.